I was very nervous when John asked me to speak tonight because I spend most of my day working on this committee, the Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. And we spend a lot of time on the committee, and John's a great member of the committee, talking about the military dimension of this competition with China, the economic dimension of this competition with China, and the technological competition component of this competition with China. And this is the primary dynamic shaping the foreign policy discussion in Washington, D.C. But it wasn't obvious to me what connection any of that would have with the subject of this gathering. That wasn't until I heard a story recently from a young man that came into contact with the committee who was a graduate student from the People's Republic of China. And he was a quiet opponent of the regime. And when I asked why he opposed the Chinese Communist Party, he answered simply, and this was very surprising to me. He said, "Because I have faith." And he didn't mean faith in democracy or faith in the future, though he may well have had faith in those things too. He meant faith in God. And he was eager to explain why, in his view, the regime was so bent on destroying faith. If they can stamp out our belief in anything greater, he said, life becomes nothing more than the incentives of the party that it can offer and the punishments it can deliver. That is the goal. That is the goal of the Chinese Communist Party. Reduce men and women to flesh and bones, simple tools to use to fulfill party objectives, sacrificed or disposed of at will. Because for that entity, a proudly Marxist-Leninist regime that sees itself as Stalin's rightful heir, you heard that right, Stalin, individuals do not have inherent worth. Chairman Mao famously remarked, "I'm not afraid of nuclear war. China has a population of 600 million. Even if half of them are killed, there are still 300 million people left." That's a statement that's unthinkable in most of our countries. But the party does not exist to serve the people exist to serve the party, even if only as cannon fodder. That's why they spend more on internal security than on their military. That's why they have such a pervasive censorship system. And that's why, as this young Chinese man explained, the CCP is desperate, and here's where I think it intersects with your mission. The CCP is desperate to crush religion. Because the very concept of an individual with dignity and worth must be destroyed. And religion is its most vehement defender. So for decades, they've tried mightily, desperately to destroy belief in God entirely. They've famously imprisoned believers in mass. They've tortured them. They've sent millions of Uyghurs, Falun Gong, and other religious minorities to re-education camps. There's a genocide active underway in Xinjiang province, the largest internment of an ethno-religious minority since the Holocaust. They've destroyed Buddhist statues, they've bulldozed monasteries, they've destroyed mosques and churches, they've used artillery to shell holy sites in Lhasa, and tried to kill the Dalai Lama. They've ripped millions of Tibetan children from their parents, many as young as 3 years old, and sent them to colonial boarding schools in order to destroy their faith and sense of self. But despite all of that, they have failed. And why is that? Because you cannot, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much power you have at your disposal, you simply cannot kill the truth. The Soviets learned this lesson the hard way. 32 years ago, in their own war against religion, hundreds of thousands chanted, "We want God," as they gathered to see Karol Wojtyła, now known as Pope St. John Paul II, celebrate Mass in Poland in June of 1979. You cannot stamp out the truth. That being said, what has the CCP done in the face of this failure? Have they given up? No. Rather, they've pivoted. They've pivoted in a pattern that you see repeated wherever the party is presented with a force too powerful to destroy, to a more insidious and more dangerous tactic. It's called co-optation. or as Chairman Xi calls it, the sinicization of Chinese religion. So instead of destroying religion, the CCP has decided to harness religion as a tool to control people's minds. What does Xi Jinping's quest to make the faithful serve the party rather than God look like? It looks like, in churches across Henan province, local CCP officials are replacing the 10 Commandments with Xi Jinping quotes. "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," becomes diktats like resolutely guard against the infiltration of Western ideology. So let me translate that for all of you. Xi Jinping has no problem with the first commandment so long as he and the party are playing the role of God. It looks like a camera, a government-controlled camera in every house of worship, letting the faithful know their every word is being monitored. It looks like a 10-year project to rewrite the Bible, the Quran, and other sacred texts in a way that flips their very meaning. Take, for example, the Gospel of John. You know, as a Catholic, spending so much time with John Molinar, I've had to actually reacquaint myself with Scripture and even quote it from time to time, even though that's uncomfortable for me. But remember the famous part in the Gospel of John when Jesus famously defends a woman caught committing adultery against her accusers. Comes up with the most famous comeback of all time, "Let he among you who is without sin cast the first stone." And the chastened accusers slink away, and Jesus says to the woman, "Has no one condemned you? Then neither do I condemn you. Go forth and sin no more." This is a beautiful story about forgiveness and mercy. Unless, of course, you're a government official in China. Then it's a story about a dissident challenging the power of the state. So how did the party deal with this? They had an official approved version of the Bible where they rewrote the ending of that story in the Gospel of John so that it ended not with mercy, but with something that would seem very unusual to those of you in this audience who have read that story again and again. When we get to the end, when Jesus is left alone with the adulterous woman, he says, "I too am a sinner. But if the law could only be executed by men without blemish, then the law would be dead." And then Jesus does something very unusual. He picks up the stone and he stones the woman to death. Why? Why change that story? Because there can be no power greater than the power of the state as controlled by the party. That is the point of corrupting and cynicizing religion. And I tell you this story because I believe that it offers some crucial insights for the way forward with how we in this town not only heal our internal divisions, but seek peace on the world stage. The first is the true nature of who we're up against. We're up against an enemy that does not believe in individual dignity. We're up against an enemy that rejects the inherent worth and preciousness of each individual, that does not believe men and women are made in the image of God. For the CCP, humans are material objects to be used for whatever purposes the party deems appropriate. The problem for the party is that these things are not true, and they have never been true. Which leads us to our second insight. The key to our victory and to the ultimate unraveling of the enemy that we face. If you go back to 1979, Pope John Paul II knew that the power of communism in Poland lay not in Soviet tanks, but in the acceptance of the lies that drove them. Destroy the lies, and China's tanks too will rust in the fields. The same is true today. It is that divine truth that gives people clarity to see evil, and the courage in the words of John Paul to the faithful behind the Iron Curtain to be not afraid. As the pastor of one Chinese church stated, in this war, in Xinjiang, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Chengdu, the rulers have chosen an enemy that can never be imprisoned, the soul of man, and they are doomed to lose. That is an assessment that we must work together to make sure comes true. After that dinner that I referenced at the beginning, the young man I spoke about, I went home and I prayed. And that night I had a thought. You know, we're taught in political science classes that the opposite of far-left communist totalitarianism is capitalist democracy. But I thought that night, as I was reflecting upon the insights that young man, that brave young man, had showed me, that that's probably wrong. That may be entirely wrong. Maybe the opposite of communism isn't a political economic system at all. Because communism itself is not a political economic system. It's a perverted inverse religion. It's an all-consuming ideology imposed not by free belief, but by force and indoctrination. Its churches are the labor camps, the gulags, the re-education centers. Its confession booths are torture chambers. Its priests are the censors, the propagandists, the secret police. I thought to myself that night that maybe the opposite of communism is actually faith in God. Communism seeks domination. What does faith seek? Faith seeks love. Communism seeks the obliteration of the individual on the altar of the collective. Faith seeks the dignity of the individual, the respect due to each and every one of us as a child of God. Faith seeks the elevation of man's soul, while communism seeks its abasement. The essence of Marxism is class struggle, pitting different elements of society against one another. Mutual suspicion, neighbor against neighbor. Mao took this to a new level with his doctrine of continuous revolution. This was ever escalating purges of those deemed counter-revolutionary, which even led to hundreds of rightists being literally eaten by crazed Maoists during the Cultural Revolution. But there is a commandment that we all know that is fatal to this dark world order. A simple commandment we all know. Love one another as I have loved you. If we follow that commandment, how could you ever inform on your neighbors? How could you participate in purging your adversaries? How could you tolerate the gulags, the labor camps, the re-education centers? The famous Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was himself a long-time incarceree at one of the gulags under Stalin, perhaps put it best. While I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of old people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. And since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. And in the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing the way the rubble left by the upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of our ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not have put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. The opposite of communism is not capitalism, it is not democracy, it is faith in God. I chair our committee. On strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party. But this strategic competition is not a test of 2 different militaries. It's not a test of 2 different socio-economic systems. It is at its core a struggle for souls. Our entire foreign policy, our entire statecraft must be built on this recognition of soulcraft. And the good news is, in that struggle for souls, we have a more powerful weapon than any economic sanction, a more powerful weapon than any military armed with missiles and nuclear weapons, a more powerful weapon than a Taylor Swift tweet or a presidential proclamation. We have Jesus Christ. And amidst this time of growing international turmoil, amidst this time of political division, disheartening divides here in America, as long as we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith, we simply cannot lose. God bless you. Thank you for letting me share some words. Appreciate it.